Well, it's 4 o'clock. I'm Rick Wilson, the director of Scientia, and I'd like to thank you for virtually attending today's lecture. This is the start of a new season for Scientia, and this year's series is entitled Trade-Offs. Well, trade-offs are always with us, whether balancing work and family, self and community, privacy and safety, present needs, or future goals. Trade-offs are a part of virtually every facet of human life. Well, this year, Scientia looks at the science, philosophy, ethics, economics, and art of the balancing acts that are so much a part of the human condition. Since we decided on this topic, trade-offs have become even more important as we decide in various ways how to work around COVID-19. Well, today's speaker knows a great deal about trade-offs that confront society in general and rice specifically. We're particularly fortunate to have Reginald DesRoches, the Howard Hughes Provost, the Professor of Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Professor of Department of Mechanical Engineering as our speaker. His talk is entitled The 2018 Haiti Earthquake, a story of history, race, poverty, and natural hazards. Well, Provost DesRoches was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and raised in Queens, New York. He received his BS, MS, and PhD from Berkeley and began his career as an assistant professor at Georgia Tech. He rose through the ranks and became the Karen and John Huff School chair and professor of civil and environmental engineering at Georgia Tech. Rice lured him away in 2017. We became the William and Stephanie Sick Dean of Engineering, and this past summer he became provost of Rice University. His primary research interests are the design of buildings and critical infrastructure under earthquake loads and seismic risk assessment. He has a particular interest in mitigating the impacts of earthquakes in the Caribbean and Western Africa. He's published more than 350 articles in the general area of earthquake engineering and seismic risk assessment and has given hundreds of presentations in 30 different countries. He serves on the National Construction Safety Team Advisory Committee and chairs the advisory board for the Natural Hazards Engineering Risk Research Infrastructure Simulation Center. He has chaired the ASCE Seismic Effects Committee as well as the Executive Committee of the Technical Council on Lifeline Earthquake Engineering. Provost DesRoches has won many awards, including more recently the Distinguished Arnold Kerr Lecturer Award in 2019, the John A. Bloom Distinguished Lecturer Award in 2018, and the 2018 Earthquake Engineering Research Institute Distinguished Lecturer Award, one of the highest honors in the earthquake engineering field. He's a fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers and in 2020 became a member of the National Academy of Engineering. I want to note that when I first asked Reggie to give this talk back in March, he readily agreed. Well, then he got busy. Mid-March was a tough time around the country. When I asked him to lead off Scientia's lecture series this fall, he responded within 5 minutes of my email, happy to add this to his ever-growing list of things to do. He's agreed to speak for 35 to 40 minutes and leave time for questions at the end. You're invited to ask your questions using the chat function anytime during the course of the talk. I'll moderate by relaying your questions at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I give you Provost Reggie DesRoches. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate it. Can you hear me?
Correct. Yes, no problem.
And can you hopefully see my screen now?
Screen is fine.
All right. Well, anyways, it's a pleasure to be here today to present the first lecture, the first in the series of lectures. And it's certainly probably the most challenging talk I've had to give. Normally I give a talk and it's very technical on the work that I do as a structural earthquake engineer. But I wanted to do something a little different because this event, the Haiti earthquake, is about technology, it's about engineering, it's about natural hazards, but it's also about history and the history of Haiti and how that really contributed to what many consider the greatest natural disaster in recent times. So I tried to tie the two together and spend the first 15 minutes talking a little bit about the history of Haiti and then around 20 minutes about earthquakes and what we learned from that particular earthquake. So the 2010 Haiti earthquake was one of the largest natural disasters in modern times, and certainly the most devastating in the Western Hemisphere. It was a magnitude 7 earthquake, which is, we consider, earthquake engineers consider a moderate earthquake, but resulted in somewhere in the order of 250,000 deaths. The exact number is unknown, partly because of the way they were disposing of bodies in mass graves at the earthquake. And the Haitian government believes it's around 310,000. The US government believes it's closer to 200,000, but it's certainly in that range of really unbelievable disasters. 300,000 were injured, and about half the population in the metropolitan area of Haiti were homeless after the earthquake. In general, if people know one thing about Haiti, it's about the Haitian Revolution. Haiti did the unthinkable of overthrowing a colonial slave society to form the first Black republic. Even if you know little about Haiti and its history, you can recognize that the boldness and unprecedented nature of the act set it on a distinctly different path. This sentence, paraphrased from a book on this revolution by the Atlantic historians David Armitage and Julia Gaffield, gets at the complexities of the revolution. In the US, we understand revolutions, especially our own, as liberating, freedom-granting, and defining events. While Haiti's revolution was surely defining, liberating not as much. Yes, Haitians were free from slavery and could form their own government, but a stirring international reaction led by France to the new Black Republic dramatically changed its history. The destruction of Port-au-Prince following the earthquake, shown on the left, is absolutely connected to what Armitage and Gaffield are saying on the right. Haiti's presence is defined by its tumultuous past, one marked by racism, imperialism, and exploitation. Today, I'm going to talk about some of these key moments in Haitian history, the revolution and its relationship to France and foreign countries, and why this context is crucial to understanding the real impact of the 2010 Haiti earthquake. So the Haiti earthquake is personal for me. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. The picture on the left is a picture of me and my 2 brothers and my dad. I think it's the last picture we have before we left Haiti in 1968. The picture on the right is a picture shortly after we arrived and moved to Queens, New York, again with my 2 brothers and my dad, mom, and grandmother. I do have a sister, but somehow she found a way never to be in pictures. I'm the youngest of 4, and my grandmother, who lived to be 102, was mother was from Haiti and father was from Puerto Rico. So I have obviously a strong connection to Haiti, not just because I'm an earthquake engineer, but because I was born in Haiti and raised in a Haitian community in Queens. So considering Haiti's bad luck with natural disasters, periods of instability, and crippling finances, it's not a stretch to believe that Haiti is cursed. This view, however, fails to take into account any of Haiti's historical context that is essential to understanding why Haiti is in the position it is today. In reality, attributing Haiti's experiences with natural disasters to bad luck, or repeatedly using the phrase, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, erases the role of France and other foreign actors in stagnating the country's economy. Especially after the earthquake in 2010, mainstream discussions failed to identify the key historical factors at the root of the tragedy in the earthquake. There's no doubt that Haiti, standing as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, contributed to the dramatic losses. As you can see here, Haiti has a GDP of around $9 billion, average annual income of $790 per year, and the average person lives on less than $2 per day. So in the days and months following the Haiti earthquake, headlines like these were not uncommon. Days after the earthquake, Christian evangelist Pat Robertson publicly claimed that the disaster was a result of Haiti's 200-year-old pact with the devil to free themselves from France. This statement did not come out of nowhere, however, as the story had been popularized by evangelists and missionaries in the 1990s to attempt to convert Haitians. In addition to devoting resources to discussing and eventually debunking Robertson's claim, mainstream media largely failed to inform people about the legacy of colonialism, slavery, and Haiti's massive debt to France when discussing the earthquake. Haiti's presence is absolutely a product of its past. That could be said for any nation, of course, but historian Laurent Dubois makes an argument that Haiti is different. In becoming a nation, Haiti achieved the unthinkable and then navigated an international system that still remains hostile to this day. After achieving freedom, Haiti faced numerous internal and external challenges to fully define that freedom that they fought for. Before we discuss Haiti, the independent country, we need to back up and look at its predecessor, the French colony of Saint-Domingue. While the history of Haiti, Saint-Domingue, and Hispaniola starts before the arrival of the French or even Columbus, for today we are going to start with the tail end of the French colony of Saint-Domingue. The second half of the 18th century was a particularly prosperous time for France. Saint-Domingue was the crown jewel of the French Empire in America, largely thanks to sugar, coffee, and cocoa plantations worked by enslaved Africans shipped to the Caribbean. Unlike the American colonies, Saint-Domingue was never intended to be a settler colony. From the start, Saint-Domingue was designed specifically to extract resources for the wealth of France. By the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue dominated the global sugar production and grew half of the world's coffee. Atlantic scholars consider Saint-Domingue to be one of the two examples of a perfected system of plantation slavery, the other being Jamaica. A central part of this plantation system was a strict hierarchy with a small white elite and a large population of slaves. While France reaped the benefits, there was a steep human price. Any kind of intense labor in those conditions were backbreaking. Sugar production is extremely laborious and a dangerous task. Each year, 5 to 10% of the entire slave population on Saint-Domingue died due to overwork and disease. The human cost of slavery translated to anywhere from 22,000 to 45,000 lives lost each year. Instead of providing better work or living conditions, France supplemented their losses with a steady shipment of enslaved Africans. Haiti's revolution falls into the Age of Revolution, a period of revolutionary activity that created this country, our country, discarded absolute monarchy in France, and birthed numerous Latin and South American countries. This era is well known for being influenced by the Enlightenment and the endorsement of a nation states over absolute monarchies. While Haiti's revolution, like many others, got rid of European colonial power, this revolution was different in so many ways. The Haitian Revolution was a successful insurrection by self-liberated slaves against French colonial rule in Saint-Domingue, now the sovereign state of Haiti. The revolt began on the 22nd of August, 1791, and ended in 1804 with the former colony's independence. It involved blacks, mulattoes, French, Spanish, and British participants, with the ex-slave Toussaint Louverture leading the group. The revolution was the only slave uprising that led to the founding of a state that was both free from slavery and ruled by non-whites and former captives. It is now widely seen as a defining moment in the history of the world and had numerous implications in the United States. Although it took a decade of fighting for the Republic of Haiti to be born, it was an uphill journey for the young nation. Gaining recognition from foreign countries, especially France and the United States, was a saga that played for decades. Foreign countries largely shunned Haiti. The UK, France, and the US all waited decades to grant Haiti recognition. A key but well-known dynamic in the debate of whether to support the revolution or not was the Louisiana Purchase. If you can recall, before 1804, the Louisiana Territory formed part of France's North American Empire with other colonies like Quebec and Haiti. Once the US got rid itself from British control, they still had to deal with two European powers on their borders, Spain and France. The Louisiana Territory was a lucrative and strategic piece of land, giving whoever controlled it access to New Orleans and the Missouri River. Securing this territory was a win-win for the United States. Uncoincidentally, the US purchased the territory from France exactly 1 year before Haiti secured its independence. There is no consensus on how to respond to the Haitian Revolution in the US because an independent Haiti and the reestablishment of the French control brought their own positives and negatives. The US stood to benefit from independent Haiti or colonial Saint-Domingue, albeit in different ways. An independent Haiti, however, also meant that the US could capitalize on the losses within France's American empire. Once it became clear to France that Saint-Domingue, the linchpin of their North American empire and key commercial colony, was lost, they gave up hope on the Louisiana Territory. Without Haiti, the North American territory was worth so little to France that the US was able to buy it at a relatively cheap price. The sale of this territory was monumental for the expansion of the US, and in the end, it was the fact that the Haitian revolutionaries were able to defeat Napoleon that the US was able to secure the Louisiana Purchase. When the US was discussing whether or not to recognize Haiti, France prepared to finally recognize Haiti 2 decades after its independence, but with one large condition. The timing of the French Revolution came at a particularly prosperous period for the colony of Saint-Domingue. The Haitian Revolution destroyed a massive revenue stream for the colony, and France was not about to let that go. Seeking retribution, France decided to shackle Haiti with a massive debt with the full knowledge that Haiti could not pay it. The issuance of this debt was a critical turning point for Haiti. In the decades that followed, Haiti would have to take extensive and damaging measures to pay back the original debt until the 1940s. This is the original text from the ordinance that King Charles X sent to Haiti in 1825. There are 3 important things to focus on. First, nowhere in the document did France use the term Haiti, the established name of the country for over 2 decades at that point. Instead, they refer to the French part of Santo Domingo, continuing to use colonial names and insist on some sort of French claim to the territory. Second, notice how the money is directed to former settlers, meaning white planters and plantation owners. Finally, let's draw our attention to the 150 million franc amount. The amount imposed on Haiti in 1825 totaled 150 million francs. In today's currency, that amount totals over $21 billion. France's final proposal was a result of many stages of negotiation between the Haitian and French governments. Haiti was flexible, offering France generous trading terms and even a feudal type relationship, but France stood firm that planters should be reimbursed. The demand for 150 million was accompanied by a French naval fleet stationed in Port-au-Prince if the Haitian government did not agree. 150 million was not a wholly random number, but France justified their claim by saying that 150 million was the annual revenue Saint-Domingue brought France. While Saint-Domingue was rich, Haiti was not. Plantations were burned and destroyed, and without the cruel practice of slavery, productivity and cash exports were not nearly as high as colonial levels. 2 decades after independence, 150 million now was 300 times Haiti's annual GDP. As stated, Haiti was the crown jewel of the French Empire, and they priced it as such. To compare, the US only paid 60 million for the Louisiana Purchase, a territory 74 times that of Haiti. To pay back France, Haiti had a few options. By 1830, about 10% of the population worked for the military government, with the remaining 90% working on small farms or large plantations. This economic recovery was stagnated by the fact that many of the extensive machinery and tools used to make sugar were destroyed during the revolution, leaving Haitians to rebuild the very plantations they rebelled against. These codes criminalized vagrancy and set up rural police system, meaning anyone not employed as an agricultural laborer, soldier, or government official faced criminal charges. By 1898, 50% of Haiti's national debt went towards repaying France. By 1914, that proportion had climbed to 80%. Clearly, what happened nearly 200 years before the earthquake impacted what we saw in 2010, in January of 2010. So let's shift our focus to the earthquake and its aftermath. Again, the Haiti earthquake, a magnitude 7 earthquake, a moderate earthquake, killed roughly 250,000 people in that one event, larger than any other event in modern history, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. A few months after the Haiti earthquake, there was an 8.8 magnitude earthquake that occurred in Chile. This earthquake is roughly 500 times the size in terms of the energy release as the Haiti earthquake, since the earthquake magnitudes are in log scale. So it's a massive earthquake, certainly significantly larger than the Haiti earthquake. But as you can see here from this slide, significantly different number of deaths, as well as injuries, as well as those left homeless. Many people like to say this is a clear example of the poor construction in Haiti and the poor planning as it relates to earthquake. Many articles noted that, but this is really a bit of a misconception. These are two very different earthquakes and were felt very differently. So on the left-hand side, you see the Chile earthquake was a magnitude 8.8, significantly larger than the 7.0 Haiti earthquake, but it was over 200 miles away from a major population center of Santiago, Chile, whereas the Haiti earthquake was a mere 15 miles away from a heavily, densely populated city of Port-au-Prince. In addition, the Chile earthquake was a fairly deep earthquake compared to the Haiti earthquake, which was 8 miles below depth, and the Chile earthquake was 22 miles. And what that means is when the actual earthquake hits the surface, it is felt much differently in the Haiti earthquake. Although it was a smaller earthquake, the level of shaking, in fact, was considerably larger in Port-au-Prince than it would have been in parts of Santiago, which was the closest major city to the Chile earthquake. So this was a bit of a misnomer when people say that the Chile earthquake was a lot larger, but it had a lot less damage. In fact, the Haiti earthquake had pretty significant shaking because of the proximity to the city center. So again, this is an image showing a typical representation of a Haitian community on the hillside. Clearly there are issues with poor construction, very densely populated, and there's no doubt that in fact this contributed to some of the damage we observed in the 2010 earthquake. So I was part of a team that traveled to Haiti, one of the first teams that traveled to Haiti shortly after the earthquake. It was around 9 days after the earthquake in 2010. People were still being discovered alive in buildings at that point. When we typically do earthquake reconnaissance, we typically wait 3 to 6 months after an earthquake, and we typically go there to see what we can learn about what worked well, what didn't work well, and we typically take these things back to modify building codes here in the US. This was a very different type of visit. We went there primarily to help the Haitian government and various agencies to understand which buildings were safe enough to reoccupy during a point where things were still very acute in terms of the phase they were in following the earthquake. This is a map showing the fault structure from the earthquake, and in the purple you see the heavily, densely populated city of Port-au-Prince, and you can see how close the fault line came to Port-au-Prince and the level of shaking you could imagine in parts of the Port-au-Prince area. So again, we were there. We would wake up every day around, there was a group of 10 of us, mostly Canadian, French-speaking, or from France, or Haitian Americans, engineers and architects that were part of this team that traveled to Haiti. We would wake up every day at around 6:30, get in a car and visit somewhere between 15 and 20 structures every day, and then come back in the evening. We visited a lot of different types of structures: schools, hospitals, warehouses. This was a very common type of structure that we would go assess. In this case, this is a food warehouse where they stored over 1,500 tons of food. And we were asked to determine whether this structure was safe enough to be able to occupy, get the food out. You can see here from this photo on the upper left-hand side, there were walls that were pretty unstable, and there was a number of walls on the backhand side that were very similar. If this were a structure in the US, we were doing a typical assessment, we would have said that this was not a safe enough structure to go in and occupy. But this is a perfect example of trade-offs where, in this case, we knew that if we would not allow them to go into this building, the trade-off would be a lot of people would go hungry, even though in theory, this was not a safe enough building to go into. We felt the risk was small enough for them, given the repercussions of them not being able to retrieve the food that was in this particular warehouse. Another building that we visited was the Ministry of Justice courthouse. You can see this is a complete collapse of a 3-story building. 7 workers were still in the courthouse, were still missing and presumed dead. The Minister of Justice needed us to figure out a way to get into the building to obtain critical documents. And so we had to do a structural assessment of the structural integrity to figure out how best to get in here. We later found out that they needed to get in there to obtain documents that had addresses of prisoners that has escaped a prison that had collapsed, or several prisons that had collapsed during the earthquake. Clearly, this was another example of trade-offs, because although there were bad guys that had clearly collapsed, but there were probably also political prisoners that they were going to obtain addresses for, that we were helping them to get these addresses, and we didn't know that at the time that we were asked to do this. One of the major impacts from the earthquake were a significant number of the ministry buildings in Haiti collapsed. They were all located in a fairly small area in downtown Port-au-Prince. This is the Ministry of Agriculture building, unreinforced masonry structure that had, in this case, it didn't collapse, but it wasn't usable, it had to be demolished following the event. The largest tragedy was just the sheer number of children that died in the earthquake. And this is a photo of a kindergarten building that we had passed by. There were 43 children that had died in this building during the earthquake. And as you see here, roughly a third of the deaths occurred to children less than 17 years old. And so a whole generation of young kids died in the Haiti earthquake. The earthquake occurred in the afternoon, which means there were still a lot of people that were either at school or at work, which led also to the large death toll that we saw in this earthquake. There were a number of lessons that were learned from a structural perspective and the many failures that occurred in the Haiti earthquake. One of the challenges that Haiti has, and countries like Haiti, particularly countries in the Caribbean, countries in Latin America, face, is that because they have a frequent history of hurricanes, they typically design for hurricanes, which is a very different type of design with heavy floor systems, thick, massive structures, because that tends to work well for hurricanes where you have an imposed load. For earthquakes, the earthquake load is proportional to the mass or the weight of the structure. And so you want your structure to be as light as possible. And you end up with a lot of structures like this where you have fairly massive floor systems, fairly small columns, and they just don't do well, particularly if they're not adequately detailed. They don't do well in earthquakes. And here's another photo of a very common type of failure we see all over the world. Again, you have these massive structures, very stiff, very large weight on top, and they're supported on fairly small columns, fairly open for a number of reasons at the bottom, and all the earthquake loads comes to the base. And when you have a situation like this, it's very difficult to be able to resist the earthquake lateral loading. One of the other problems had to do with materials, in this case, steel reinforcement, which we use obviously in reinforced concrete design as a combination of concrete with reinforcing steel placed in areas to try to provide adequate ductility. And here we see one of the problems in Haiti was both the placement as well as the quantity of steel was not adequate for many of the structures in Haiti. Here we see again, this is what we call a beam column connection. Normally what you want to see is a significant amount of steel that's perpendicular to the longitudinal steel wrapped around the longitudinal steel. And what that does is it confines your concrete in a manner that allows it to bend very easily without breaking. It allows it to be what we call ductile design. We actually design structures to bend without breaking, as opposed to designing them to be elastic. We design them to have deformation and damage, but damage that's such that the structure still remains standing after an event. And this is just a picture to give you a sense of the type of reinforcement we typically like to see in a structure in the transverse direction to provide adequate ductility, and that was not the case in Haiti. One of the concerns that we identified was the quality of the material used, in this case, the quality of the concrete. So when you make concrete, it's a combination of cement mixed with sand and small and large aggregate, and of course, water mixed together, and then it cures to create concrete. One of the problems in Haiti is they use too much water, again, trying to get more out of the material without additional cost. When you use too much water, the water to cement ratio is a critical factor in the strength. And if you have too much water compared to cement, you're going to end up with concrete that's just too weak. And so we wanted to test out this theory. So on one of the subsequent trips, I think this was roughly 6 or 8 months after the event, we traveled to Haiti with a group of researchers. This is a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation to look at the strength of concrete. And so what we did was we would go to, every time there was a construction site, we'd go and we'd collect samples of concrete being poured. We brought cylinders with us, we pour the concrete, we would cap it, and we did quite a few cylinders, and we brought them back to the US and tested them after 56 days, which is a standard approach to test these cylinders to get their nominal strength. And what we found was that it was significantly weaker. The concrete was significantly weaker than the standard strength we would expect in the US. Typically, concrete has a nominal strength of 3,000 to 4,000 PSI. PSI means pounds per square inch. The force you can impose on it before it fails. And the common strength we were finding in Haiti was around 1,300 pounds per square inch. So yet another challenge they had was just the weak concrete that was used in many of the structures, and particularly the informal buildings that were used. Concrete strength was just not adequate. One of the problems Haiti has had for decades is deforestation, removing of trees in Haiti because they use it as cooking fuel. And you can see here, this is a picture overlooking the island of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic to the east, Haiti to the west. And you can see the difference in forest coverage between the two countries because of decades of deforestation in Haiti. And that has a couple of impacts. Clearly, you have erosion on some of these areas, which is a big problem when you have hurricanes and lots of flooding. When you don't have the trees, you have a lot more erosion occurring on the hillside. But as far as earthquakes are concerned, that means you really don't have adequate wood to be able to make more wooden structures, which we know tend to be safer in earthquakes. They're primarily safer because of the light weight and the flexibility. And this is an example that I took of a picture that I took of a area in Haiti where you had a concrete building adjacent to a wood frame building. And you can see here, the concrete building is completely demolished, is crumbled, and the wood building has some damage, but is still standing. Again, they received the same level of shaking because they're adjacent to each other, yet one of them did not perform well because of the heavy mass and the lack of adequate ductile detailing in the structure. So one of the challenges Haiti had following the earthquake was just a massive amount of debris in Haiti. In fact, there were 25 million cubic yards of debris. I think at that point, there had been very few natural disasters ever recorded that produced that much debris. There was enough debris to fill the Superdome 10 times over again. So really a significant amount of debris. At the time, USAID, who was coordinating some of the debris removal efforts, had initiated a program where instead of using all the resources available to USAID in massive trucks to remove the debris, they were paying Haitians to remove them by hand as a way of getting resources to the Haitian population, to the people in Haiti. We estimated at that rate, it would have taken roughly, at the rate they were removing debris in Haiti, and this was in about 6 months after the earthquake, it would have taken on the order of 20 years to remove all the debris from the earthquake. And so we wrote an op-ed to the New York Times telling USAID that they need to figure out a way, they need to stop this program and really need to accelerate the debris removal because a country cannot recover if you have debris everywhere for a number of reasons, including the recovery process and the response process is tied to debris in the streets and not being able to move around and the logistics challenges you have when you do that. And so got in a bit of trouble. Fortunately, this is where tenure is good, but I got called into the dean's office. It made a lot of headlines. We had a lot of faculty that got funds from USAID, but we felt it was important to highlight the shortcoming of the approach that they were taking in terms of debris removal. 2 weeks later, they changed course and initiated a program that really accelerated the removal of debris in Haiti, and they were able to do it at an accelerated pace. And I think within 9 to 12 months, the majority of the debris was moved in Haiti. And so I see this as this is the most important 400 words that I ever put on paper because it really did have an impact in the recovery of Haiti following the earthquake. Low-rise residential construction. This is a very common type of home where you have masonry blocks with a concrete roof system and concrete slab. one of the things that we learned in this earthquake is the sequence in which these are constructed can have a huge impact on the safety of these buildings. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing the common sequence that was typically done, where you would cast the floor slab, you would cast the concrete columns, and you cast the roof. Then you come in later and put the walls in, you just fill them in. When you do it that way, that structure is extremely vulnerable to collapse. And we found many cases where those structures, in fact, did collapse in Haiti. And because of the heavy weight, people tended to die in these types of structures. On the right-hand side, if you were to just change the sequence of construction using the same materials, where you cast the walls first, you cast then the column framing system, then you put the concrete columns and the concrete roof, and you do that in integral fashion, that is a completely different structure in terms of its safety and lack of vulnerability compared to the structure on the left. And so there's been a significant approach following the Haiti earthquake to educate the population down there on how you construct these buildings using a very different sequence, but having using the same materials and having a big impact on the safety of these structures. Just to go back for a minute, following the earthquake, the issue of reparations and Haiti's economic issues rose to the forefront once again. This time, the ask was slightly different and originated outside of Haiti's border. An international group led by Cornel West and French philosophers and various European Parliament members penned an open letter to the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy, asking France to cancel Haiti's debt. They argued short-term and incremental debt relief measures didn't go far enough and did not get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is the original independence debt and the resulting ramifications for Haiti. A full debt cancellation from their perspective would begin to address that. The letter also recognized that France is not the only offender, calling out the US and international financial institutions, and hints at the French, American, Canadian coalition who assisted in the coup of President Aristide. Haiti's status as the world's first Black republic is emphasized in the letter multiple times, making it clear that racial dynamics are at play. To no surprise to anyone, including Haitians, the French government denied the request. This added to a history of non-recognition and sidelining of calls for reparations. At every instance, France would point to previous debt cancellations and relief provided after the earthquake. Even though France has helped financially, they still refuse to address the initial problem. France made Haiti pay for its freedom. What France did to Haiti was without precedent and one of the many ways European countries maintain a strict power imbalance over former colonies in the Caribbean, African, and the Middle East. There's a lot of discussion, and I'm near the very end here. There's a lot of discussion about resilience and how you build resilient communities and what makes a community resilient. And one of the things that was very interesting about the Haiti earthquake is, despite the massive devastation, roughly 1 in 10 people in the metropolitan area and the Port-au-Prince area had died. Everybody had members of their family that had either been severely injured or died. How rapidly the community rebounded, how rapidly people were back at work was incredible. I mean, talk about resilience. I can't imagine a community that's been more resilient in terms of going back to some semblance of life after the earthquake as Haiti was. A lot of it, I believe, has to do with the fact that it's been through so many trials and tribulations over its history, from 1804, many hurricanes and many coups and many political issues and challenges they've had. It's an extremely resilient country and extremely resilient people, and you saw that after the earthquake. So finally, I just want to thank those that contributed to this work. 2 former students who were students at the time of the Haiti earthquake that contributed to part of the project, some of the studies we did, both professors now, one at Clemson and one at A&M, a former master's student, Joshua Grisham, who helped particularly with some of the testing that we did. And then a student I recently hired, a recent graduate of Georgetown University, who was really instrumental in the study of the historical context for the Haiti earthquake. It wouldn't be possible without their help. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Reggie. There are a number of questions. I'm going to try and put some of them together. One question that popped up asked, Are there any hybrid designs to prevent earthquakes and hurricanes from having the same kind of impact? I mean, how do you I guess, design or think about designing for different kinds of natural disaster events? But at the same time, how do you also include in those trade-offs about the environment, poverty, the use of post-destroyed materials, etc. So if you can imagine trade-offs between lots of things that might all happen simultaneously, what kinds of words of wisdom might you have for us?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things there. Let me first talk about the trade-off, just sort of at a high level between hurricane and earthquake design, and I think we know how to do that well. The key to designing structures that are resilient in any form of lateral load is having ductile connections. And so this is, again, this picture, I put this here because this is so critical. Even if you don't have perhaps adequate materials, or if you don't know the exact level of load you're going to expect, if you design it with a certain amount of detailing that we know now, and it took us a long time in the US to figure this out. Long time meaning we learned a lot after the 1971 San Fernando earthquake in California. And in fact, there were many structures in the US, in California, that had this lack of detail, lack of steel around the base, around the connections. And now we know we need to do that. And if you do that, you're able to resist both earthquake and hurricane loads because of the ability to flex your structural elements in a safe manner. The second part of that had to do with resources. And I think clearly there's no doubt that trying to balance the economic challenges in Haiti played out. And I think that the example of the concrete was clearly one of those. So they clearly put a lot more water in their concrete because we knew that you can get more out of it at the same cost, right? But we know that the water content is directly proportional to the strength of the concrete. So that's where they made a trade-off that is a tough trade-off because we know that we're going to have poor structures. The other piece to that has to do with sustainability. So one of the projects that we did that we didn't mention here was look at recycling of rubble. Because there was so much rubble, we actually we led a project that we looked at using bad concrete. If you were to recycle bad concrete, but recycle it in a manner where you then use the concrete as the rubble and use good cement and reasonable water to cement ratio, you can actually get strong concrete similar to the strength that we get in the US, even using bad rubble. And so I think there are, and they ended up doing some of that in Haiti following, in the reconstruction following the earthquake. So there are ways of doing it. One of the challenges in Haiti was making sure that people followed the appropriate codes and procedures that we know work well.
So there's several questions that hit on a similar topic, which is you've spent a lot of time on the history of Haiti in this talk. And to what extent do you think understanding the history and culture of a society aids in the engineering side of things? How does it focus the way in which materials might be used, the way in which design might be carried out, and the way in which that can be integrated with the special features of a country or a culture?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think history and culture plays out in everything. I think certainly the culture in Haiti of the way things are done, the informal nature in which things are constructed. They were used to doing things a certain way, and that, because they were used to doing certain things a certain way and using materials a certain way and constructing a certain way, and they've done that for generations, that clearly led to what we saw in terms of some of the infrastructure that was not adequately built. And so a big part of the effort that took place after the earthquake was not so much trying to impose ways. I think you have to be careful in trying to impose the culture of another country, like whether it's the US or Europe on Haiti, but trying to educate within the context of the culture of Haiti in terms of how you rebuild things. So for example, Haiti doesn't have the level of equipment and so forth that we have in the US for some of their construction. So we went through a process of actually using buckets and using materials that they have handily available to them, and using that to talk about the proportion of different materials to make your concrete have the adequate strength. So I think you have to be important not to discard somebody's community's culture when you're trying to change the way they do things, but do it within the context of their existing culture, if that makes sense.
I'm reading through some additional questions here. Here's one that deals with the aftermath. Ed Knightley wants to know what the status of the communications infrastructure and electrical grid was like in the aftermath, and how quickly was it reconstructed. And I guess a parallel to that would be the electric grid in Puerto Rico following the hurricane there. So two different disasters, both undermining the power grid.
Yeah, so I would probably guess there was a much bigger impact in Puerto Rico because there's a much larger percentage of people that had power to begin with. At steady state, only 10% of the country of Haiti has power, something in that range. It may be 15, but it's a very, very low percentage. So in some ways, they were more resilient because they weren't so dependent on power to begin with as a country. And clearly, the little power that they had, a lot of it was not working following the earthquake, and it took many months and to restore the power they have. But because they were a country that didn't have a significant amount of power usage, they weren't as impacted as, say, Puerto Rico was after Maria and the subsequent hurricanes that they've had.
So Dominic Boyer says, it seems like the U.S. owes Haiti a debt for its own prosperity. The U.S. has been very involved in Haitian politics and other things over the years. What could the U.S. be doing now to help Haiti to close up the gap created by this kind of debt imposed by the U.S.? And more specifically, what can Rice do at this point, if anything?
And the U.S. certainly has had a close tie to Haiti. There have been obviously some challenges between the relationship between the U.S. and Haiti and some of the many dictators in Haiti. The U.S. has certainly stepped up following the earthquake. From a political perspective, I think the challenge with Haiti now is the immigration status and the inability of Haitians to freely come to the U.S. Compared to perhaps other countries. And so that's certainly one challenge. I'd love to see more engagement with universities in the U.S. and Haiti. Haiti is literally just off the coast of Florida. It's very short flight. So I'd love to see more universities and getting involved in Haiti. I think Haiti has a reputation of being a difficult place to work. It can be a difficult place to work. I traveled there, I think, 15 times in the 3 or 4 years after the earthquake, and it can be difficult to work there. But I think there needs to be a closer relationship between the U.S., both the government and the U.S. I'd love to see more relationship between the U.S. universities and Haiti because of its proximity and the historical importance of Haiti to the U.S., which many people aren't aware of.
Given that this event happened 10 years ago, to what extent do you think Haiti has recovered from this loss? And at least in terms of not only the infrastructure, but the economy? And how can one contribute to change the narrative of this country?
So it's recovered some. They started rebuilding 3 or 4 years ago. It took them a long time. Again, we're 10 years out, a little bit over 10 years out. They started rebuilding a few years ago, including the presidential palace is being rebuilt now, and many of the other ministries and other buildings. And so it's making progress. It's a challenging country because of the sheer poverty of Haiti and lack of basic things like clean water and I mentioned lack of electricity and other things. And so it's it's in a tough situation. It's going to take a lot for Haiti to get to where it needs to be. But I think there are many opportunities for universities to engage. People just don't. A lot of people aren't aware of the situation in Haiti, and again, given its proximity to many parts of the U.S., and I think it's a country that we should be much more engaged in. And I know there's a lot of engagement with the various NGOs in Haiti, but it's a country in need of a lot of help.
So I guess the question comes back to, you know, how would a university put its resources together? What teams could you imagine that would inform not only changes in building structures, but also, you know, how do you fit in with the social structure, et cetera? So,
yeah, I think the two biggest needs that Haiti has, in my opinion, are clean water, just because it's one of the fundamental things that a society needs to function. It's clean water, and Haiti has a severe lack of clean water. And then energy. I think one of the things that I'd gotten involved in before I came to Rice was projects through my previous institution that was bringing solar systems and sustainable electricity, renewable electricity to Haiti. And you can imagine what that does to change the community when you do that. And so thinking through projects like that we can do even at Rice, where you can adopt the community and bring a clean water system or a sustainable energy system, it can dramatically change the lives of populations of people in Haiti, because those are two needs that that exist and are really significant.
So basically, there's just a lot of trade-offs that need to be made, and it's a difficult set of problems to deal with, I guess. There's another question here about what's being done regarding deforestation in Haiti. This is a long-standing problem, and it certainly contributes to mudslides, et cetera, in the aftermath of hurricanes. And possibly, does that also affect what happens in the aftermath of an earthquake? So is deforestation also one of these key critical problems that Haiti faces?
Yeah, no, it certainly is. It contributes to landslides and flooding. And flooding is in many ways a bigger problem than earthquakes. I mean, obviously the 2010 earthquake was unbelievable in terms of life loss, but they have constant flooding, and it's in the hurricane path, and they will continue to have flooding, and having deforestation is an issue. My understanding is they've gone through and replanted. They have various programs where they're replanting trees, but I don't think it's keeping up with the deforestation rate. And so you continue to have a significant problem with deforestation, and we're going to see how that plays out again every time there's a rainy season and you have these mudslides occurring in many of the mountainous areas of Haiti.
What work, if any, is your team still doing with the Haitian government or the NGO?
Hope you cut off, Rick.
Sorry, I got interrupted by a dog. So the question was, what work is your team still doing with the Haitian government or different NGOs working in Haiti?
Yeah, so the last project I was part of, the Recycling Rubble project, was a few years ago. And I think they're using some of the technologies and some of the guidelines we put about. More recently, I've been involved in looking at some of the plans for the rebuilding of the presidential palace. And it's going to be such a signature structure. And this is a structure that collapsed pretty dramatically during the event. I haven't been as involved as I'd like to be, partly because of time constraints and not being able to be engaged the way I'd like to. Last time I was there was 2.5 years ago. I traveled to Haiti, and it was good to see. And before that, it had been another 2 years or so. It was good to see the rebuilding occurring, slower than I'd like, but they're starting to rebuild, and you're seeing a lot of efforts take place on training members of the community to build back safely. And that's really how it's going to happen. The structures that are being built by foreign entities like the US or European or Canada, which is the majority of the designers coming in there, there's no doubt those will be safe. I think where the challenge lies is the many people that are rebuilding their homes and making sure that they've been trained in a way that they can build things that are going to be safe for when the next earthquake occurs. And it's just a matter of time before the next earthquake occurs. Many people believe it's actually going to be in the north. There's some belief from seismologists that the Haiti earthquake, which occurred in the southern part of Haiti, put strains on the northern fault line that goes through Cap Haitian, which is another major population center. And so there's a significant effort there to try to get people prepared for the eventuality of an earthquake in that part.
Well, I want to thank you very much for leading us off this semester. It's nice to have something intellectual to follow rather than having to simply try and catch up on our teaching and so forth. So this has been very insightful, very helpful, and very enjoyable. So thank you very much, Reggie.
Oh, my pleasure.
There's still a number of questions that people have raised. I've tried to catch most of them. I think maybe we can save some and you can get back to specific people if they do have questions. But thank you very much for your time, and it's just a delightful talk. It was very.
I'd be happy if you keep those questions. I'll be happy to follow up. I have no problem.
Okay, will do. And for everyone else, I just want to let you know that we're going to have another virtual lecture on Tuesday, October 13th. It'll be former Harris County Judge Ed Emmett, someone who's also familiar with natural disasters. And the title of his talk is Enjoy Now or Let Someone Else Have a Better Tomorrow. So I hope to see everybody at our next Scientia lecture in October, on October 13th. Again, Reggie, thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate the talk. Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.